Last week we discussed some of the things that Jewish ethics or the ethics of Judaism is not. And tonight I want to begin to focus more on some of the things that Jewish ethics is. And as a segue or a transition between these two issues, that is what Jewish ethics is not and what it is, I'd like to return to the question with which I left you at the end of our session last week, a question that has challenged philosophers for centuries, and that is the question, why be moral? Why should a person act in a moral way, however you define moral way? To save you a lot of time, I'll suggest to you that if you survey the entire history of Western philosophy for, say, the last, say, 2,500 or more years, what you'll find is that all of the attempts of all of the Western philosophers to come up with an answer to this question, why be moral, can be boiled down to four approaches. So before looking into the issue of why be moral from the point of view of Jewish ethics, let's first look at how others in the Western philosophical tradition have tried to attack this issue. And as we'll see in surveying these four approaches or four types of answers to the question, why be moral, we'll see that each of them assumes certain things about the nature of the human being. And that will lead us eventually to our second topic in the curriculum, which is human nature. Because underlying every ethical system is an idea of what is human nature. Because how you perceive the nature of the human being as a moral agent assumes certain things about what you can expect from the human being as a moral agent. For example, if you assume that the human being is a creature where everything is predetermined, a creature who has no choice, who has no moral volition, then there is no moral responsibility, because moral responsibility assumes the possibility of moral choice. How can you hold somebody responsible for something they did not have a choice whether to do, something they were compelled to do, or something following certain systems that they were predestined to do? So if you have a view of the human being where the human being is assumed to be a free moral agent, you have that view of human nature, then you have the possibility of moral choice, and then you have the possibility of certain expectations regarding the person's behavior on moral issues. But if you have the assumption that the person has no choice, that if everything is predetermined, and that's the nature of the human being, then you can't expect that such a creature would be able to make moral choices, and then moral choices would become a meaningless concept. So the idea of the human being underlies every system of ethics. And sometimes that's explicit, and sometimes, as we'll see in these four approaches to the question of why be moral, it is also more implicit than explicit. So we have to sort of ferret it out. Now, the first approach, I would say, that you find in the history of Western philosophy to this question, why be moral, you find already in Plato, you find developed by Aristotle, and then you find it developed even further by the medieval scholastic philosophers. And you find this tradition going down right until today. And this is the view that that which is rational is that which is moral. You probably heard, people say to other people in meetings, for example, Why don't you be, if somebody gets upset, why don't you be rational about this? Why don't you make the rational choice? Why don't you make the reasonable choice? And the assumption here is that that which is rational is that which is true, and therefore that which is true is that which is moral, and therefore that which is rational is that which is moral. This approach is based on an assumption developed in great detail by Aristotle and then by the medieval philosophers, which has an assumption about the nature of the human being. And that assumption is that the human being may be defined, and Aristotle in fact does use this definition, that the human being may be defined as the rational animal. In other words, Aristotle asked the question, what is the difference between the human animal and other animals? And one of his answers, he had another one we'll discuss later, was the human being, as opposed to other animals, is the rational animal. Because the human being has a faculty, as he called it, in the soul, called the rational faculty of the soul. And other animals don't have this. Aristotle, in fact, linked this rational faculty of the soul to the power of speech. In other words, when he said the human being is the speaking animal, what he meant was the human being is the speaking animal because the human being has the rational faculty in the soul. In medieval philosophical Hebrew, for example, the term in Hebrew, hamedaber, which literally means the one who speaks, is another way of saying the human being, borrowing this idea or developing this idea from Aristotle. So here you have one approach to why one should be moral. Namely, one should be moral because it's the rational thing to do, and because the human being is the rational animal, and in order to express that vision of humanity, that the human being is the rational animal, in order to be human, he or she has to act in a rational way, and therefore morality is doing what is rational. Now, do you see any problems with this theory? This is a theory that was in effect for hundreds and hundreds of years. Almost, 2,000 years. Yeah.
Why rational?
That's one idea. In other words, along in the early 20th century came Freud, and Freud really upset the apple cart, because Freud argued against this view. He said the underlying reasons that people do what they do is not because they're rational animals, it's because they're irrational animals. And the rationality just covers and suppresses the irrationality. Or as the great French philosopher Pascal said, the heart has reasons that reason knoweth not. In other words, the real motivations that we have are irrational. And what rationality does is not to make them rational, but rather, as Freud would say, maybe Pascal too, to rationalize them. In other words, you give the reasons after you've already decided what to do. You see this all the time when the United States, or any other country takes some policy decision. First, they take some stupid decision, and then they give you the reasons why the decision is a good reason. I don't want to give any examples. It's an election year, but you can think of many yourselves. So it's not a reason, but rather it's a rationalization. Any other reasons this idea is maybe not so good? Yeah.
Rational thinking doesn't necessarily lead to ethical conclusions.
Right. Can you give me an example?
Nazi Germany.
Nazi Germany may be an example. That's the bad side example. Can you give me a good side example? Take, for example, altruism. Is altruism rational? Suppose you had standing here Mother Teresa, and you'd say, is she a moral person? Using this criteria of rationality. You'd say, probably not. I mean, is it rational to spend your whole life helping all these people?
If you help yourself first, you then the other people.
Well, maybe she didn't. She always put the other people first. In other words, the argument would be that altruism is irrational. How can you defend this rationally? It's against your own better interest. So maybe altruism is irrational. And if rationality is moral and altruism is irrational or super-rational or irrational, then it's not rational and therefore not moral. So therefore, if you equate rationality with morality, you exclude the possibility of the greatest kinds of moral acts, namely altruism.
What is the definition of altruism?
I would give you one definition: doing what is not rational, that is against one's self-interest. Yeah.
Your argument depends upon
It's not my argument.
No, that argument then brings up the fact that the definition of rationality could go from is fungible. So Mother Teresa might argue, I'm being rational, and you just argued she isn't being rational. A third person and a fourth person could argue whether altruism is rational or not. I mean, the discussion of what is rational is a discussable subject.
Right. So that's right. So let's use this argument to counter this position, which is that if morality is equated to the rational, it assumes that the rational is a static, identifiable idea. Since different cultures, even different people, define or view what is rational differently, then how can you equate the moral with the rational? Because in different cultures, one act in one culture can be seen as rational and therefore moral, and in another culture can be seen as irrational and therefore immoral. Or the same act can be seen in one culture as rational and immoral, and the other culture as rational and moral. So you have this, if you study the history of rationality, you study the history of philosophy, you see they have very different ideas of what is moral or what is logical. And if you equate, as many people do, what is rational with what is logical, you have a whole other problem. Because that which is logical is not always moral. And if you watch Star Trek, you know Vulcan stuff, he's always logical, but he's not always right. Yeah.
The other argument is rational implies universality.
That's exactly right. And this is the assumption of the medieval philosophers, excuse me, and even more, the assumption of the Enlightenment philosophers. That which is rational is that which is true for all times and all places. So if that which is rational is that which is moral, means that which is moral is that which is rational, it means morality can never change. Because it's true for all times and all places. So you could argue at a certain point, it's rational, say, to have an institution like slavery. Maybe at a certain point you could argue that. But you can't argue that at all points in history. In other words, in a certain point in history, they argued that slavery was a rational social institution. But you can't argue that at all points, because the idea of that which is rational changes. Okay, so you've just swept away about, say, 2,600 years of philosophical speculation on why be moral from this point of view. Now you have a second argument that develops, you have it earlier than the 19th century, but develops in the late 19th, early 20th century. And this is a view generally called the intuitionist view. Once they came to the conclusion that the view that which is rational is that which is moral has problems, and they came to the view that maybe the human being isn't the rational animal, as Aristotle said it was. Any of you heard of Bertrand Russell?
Yes.
Bertrand Russell was the winner of the Nobel Prize. He was a great philosopher and mathematician in England, and he lived till he was late in the 90s when he died. And at the end of his life, he wrote his autobiography. It's published now in a number of volumes. When you live that long, it should be a number of volumes. And at the end of the biography, he says something like this. He says, "When I was young, I read Aristotle. And I read where Aristotle said the human being is the rational animal." He says, and Aristotle was right. The human being is the rational animal. He says, but in the course of living, I made a discovery. He says, the discovery was, I never met one.
He also didn't believe in God.
Who? Bertrand Russell?
Yeah.
Well, so? He was too busy getting married. He had about 5, 6 wives, you know. The second view so develops as a kind of response to the problems with the first view. Namely, if rationality is not the key to morality and not the key to the essence of the person, then what is? So a second view develops called generally the intuitionist view. And the intuitionist view, and these views are much, more complicated than I'm making. I'm trying to give them in a kind of boiled down way, summarized way. The intuitionist view holds that every normal adult person naturally intuits that which is morally good and that which is morally evil. And the example that you find most in the modern philosophical literature is the example of perception of color. So, for example, if I say, can you define for me what is yellow? Define yellow. It's not easy, right? Define yellow. Even more difficult, say, define yellow to a person who is colorblind or blind. Define yellow. So they would say, well, we can't define yellow. But if, say, you hold up, I don't have my pad with me, you have a yellow pad. If you hold up a yellow pad or a yellow something, everybody sees it and they say, oh, I don't know how to define yellow, but that's yellow. So the argument runs, morality is the same way. You know it when you see it. You can't define it. It's not rational. But you know it when you see it. Because you intuit, you know intuitively what is good and what is morally not good. You see any problems with this argument?
It said every normal adult.
What is the implication, every normal adult? You have to find one, like Russell couldn't find a rational person?
What is normal?
How do you define normal?
Another problem. Yes, sir.
And to know something when you see it, you either had to have prior knowledge, which would have been given when you came into existence, or you had to learn from your environment. And being in a certain environment, you could think something would be normal, would be very irrational or amoral.
Yes, that's one argument. Kant would say, well, it is a priori. Kant would, I mentioned this last week, Kant had the idea that we have this sense to be able to tell what is moral and immoral because that sense is implanted in us by God, and that's a proof that God exists. That was Kant's argument. So he would say we have it all implanted in us. It is a priori. So even if you took that argument, do you have problems? Yeah.
I bring up the same objection I had to the rationality. Different people are doing different things. There's no resolution to that.
That's right. You could have, say, if I had something happened here, or I told you about something that happened, and I asked everybody here, Is this what does your intuition tell you? Is it moral? I could have as many answers. There are people here.
No way to base the system.
No way to base the system, right. Any other problems with this? It's the most obvious one.
The term naturally?
No. The most obvious is that your intuition could be wrong. You could accept this whole idea and then say, but your intuition could be wrong. In other words, you could be able to recognize an event and say it's a moral event, but you can be wrong. Your intuition could be wrong. So far you're not impressed with the workings of 2,700 years of philosophical speculation. Now we come to the third idea.
You read your book.
Pardon me?
You read your book.
Oh. Oh, that's what Patton said to Rommel. That's why he won the war. We'll see how you do. Third theory is generally called emotive theory. Emotive theory is the idea that one's emotions, in other words, this again is a response, or if you want, the flip side of the rational theory. If rationality isn't going to give you the entree to moral truth, then maybe the emotions are a more reasonable basis. You know, in the 18th century, in Western Europe, you had the ideas of the Enlightenment that rationality was the source of truth. Then by the 19th century, it was overthrown, and these more emotive theories became popular. So the idea is that your emotions or your sentiments can determine what is good or bad. For example, Hemingway, I quoted this to you last week, once was asked what is moral, and he said, what's moral is something that you feel good after you do, and what is immoral is what you feel bad after you do. So it's all reduced to a question of how you feel about something. And this is a very current theory, you know. This is a very current approach. Everything is reduced to feelings. You know, after the TWA crash, they went up to all these poor people who lost families there. Well, how do you feel about this, you know? That's the new thing. Reporters always ask, how do you feel about this? Not what do you think, not leave me alone. How do you feel about this? So the idea is the feelings, the emotions, have some validity as being the ultimate truth. So what problems do you have in terms of this emotive theory, in terms of determining what is moral and what is not? Yeah.
Well, someone's feelings, someone may feel that they would like to go out and get something from a store without any money, but that doesn't make it correct.
All right, that's a mild example. Let me give you a...
Murder. You feel you hate someone, you feel like murdering them. Does that
Well,
make it right?
right, that's the example I was going to give, but you're giving it from your head and I'm giving it from the movies, Dirty Harry. Remember the scene in Dirty Harry where the inspector, whatever he is, says to Clint Eastwood, this serial killer, why is he doing this? Remember what Inspector Callahan says? 'Cause he likes it. He likes to kill people. You like to play golf, you like to watch the Bulls. He likes to kill people. Makes him feel good. So that's one problem with it. Any other problem with it?
Well, the same person can feel absolutely differently about the same situation, from moment to moment even. So then there's nothing solid to latch onto.
Right. The emotions are volatile. The emotions change. Talk to teenagers about, you know, who they're in love with that minute. The next minute it's another one. You know,
Would you give me a definition of moral that you're working with right now?
I'm not working with any. I'm not working with any definition here. I'm going to talk later when we talk about the nature of the human being about the whole issue of definition. That itself is a problem. What does definition mean? Is there a definition of definition? That's a whole other issue. I don't want to enter it in here. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to give you some idea of why a person should be moral, without defining what moral is. Because they're assuming that if you have the approach to getting there, morality, intuition, emotion, then that itself defines what is moral. In other words, all of these approaches not only try to answer the question, why be moral, but they give you a definition of what is moral. Moral is that which is rational. Moral is that which you feel is rational, is moral, so forth.
What's the worth of moral?
What do you mean, what's the worth of moral?
For what reason would, at some point, we're entering a discussion where we've talked about many things where, I hold some belief that morality helps us to have a civilization, to be civil. We're talking about things where I can determine through intuition or emotion what right and wrong is. Where are these philosophers? What is if there's no set right and wrong, or no definition, or no purpose of being moral that we're using for a ground rule, this tends to make no sense to me.
Well, I'll ask you to put that on hold. We'll get there.
Okay.
I'm not up to that yet. I'm just trying to deal with one question at a time, The question is, how have philosophers in the West tried to justify the question of why be moral? I'll get to this other question, because the question you're really asking, the underlying question of what you're asking is the question of what is the purpose of life? And how does being moral fit into that? That's a very big question. I'm not ready to tackle that yet. I want to, tackle the simple guys first. You sometimes win more. If you watched football yesterday, you sometimes get further by tackling the little guys first. Any other problem with the emotive theory? Well, one problem is the same problem you had with the intuitive theory. The emotions can be wrong. Another problem is that the emotions, if they're at the base of why you should be moral, can justify anything. Well, now we already blew away more than 2,700 years. Now we come to the fourth theory. Fourth theory, very popular in this century, is often called the social theory of ethics, and is a theory that was probably introduced by philosophers, by sociologists. But you find the basis for it already in Aristotle, because Aristotle, one of his other definitions of the human being, is the human being as the social animal, or the political animal. And here the idea is that there is no universal ethics. There is no universal right and wrong, but rather ethics, like everything else, is socially determined. In other words, the society, the culture, determines what is right and wrong. So therefore, in this approach, you cannot look at the big question, what is right and wrong, all across the board, all across the world, all across every country, all across the centuries. You can only ask the question within a given society, within a given culture. Does this particular culture view certain acts as right or certain acts as wrong? Now, what do you think about that?
It's getting worse.
It's getting worse? Why is it getting worse?
Well, it makes more sense than the others, but
makes more
it's not
sense to me.
universal, so it's frustrating, because I think there's no universality.
Well, that's the argument. The argument is, since there is no universality, since we can't find across the board in every culture the idea that something is morally right or something is morally wrong, then we have to localize it and look into particular cultures.
What happens when one culture's idea of what's right and what's wrong conflicts with another culture?
That's the issue. So you say, they're both right. You know, like the old joke, you're right and you're also right.
Okay.
They're all right for that culture. Or you can take another position. The other position is, like Orwell says, an Animal Farm. Some animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. All animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. In other words, every culture has a different idea of what is right and wrong, but our culture, whatever that happens to be, is righter or more right than all the others. So you have two possibilities here. See, if you read some of the rhetoric now coming out of some of the Arabic countries, this is exactly what they're arguing against the United States. That we want to impose our morality on them. Because they have their morality and we have our morality, but we say our morality is better, so we should impose it on them. But the assumption is that you have a social structure where a certain morality fits there, but doesn't fit somewhere else. So, for example, no Jewish grandchild would set their grandmother out in a snowdrift to die. But in an Eskimo culture, it happens. Do you see any problems with this? Yeah.
It doesn't really answer the question that you were talking about of why we should be moral. It just answers the question of why everyone has different morals.
Well, it answers the question by saying we all live in a society, and in order for that society to function, everybody has to play by the rules of that society, and that society determines what is right and wrong within the society.
But I thought, well, wasn't it supposed to, or couldn't it answer the question of why you need the morals for that society? We understand that that society needs the morals, but why does that society need the morals?
That's the question he asked. I'm not up to that yet.
Okay,
Yeah.
Is it moral to impose one standards of one society on another?
If you assume it's better, but how are you going to justify that it's better?
Well, sending out your grandmother isn't better.
Well, if you're an Eskimo, it is. So what can I tell you?
And one time we sent out leopards, so, you know.
Well, that was a leopard, but the grandmother isn't diseased. No,
The
but she
leopard
can't
wasn't
work.
contagious.
She can't work.
Leprosy wasn't contagious.
But what about this theory? What do you think about this theory? Yeah.
The society as a whole can be wrong about what's right and wrong, just as much as an individual can
Can
be.
you give me an example?
Well, you gave one last week, and that's Nazi Germany. I mean, they had the idea that, you know, that the Aryan race was better than anybody else, and that they had to get rid of, you know, those people who didn't belong to that, or didn't live, or didn't meet their standards of racial purity or whatever. I mean, it's happened in all kinds of, you know, societies. You know, and then in Spain, you know, during the Inquisition, they didn't, you know, the Catholic Church had their standards about who was a moral person and who wasn't, as far as, you know, the Catholic Church goes, and so they thought nothing of, you know, burning heretics at the stake.
All right, so in other words, the argument you're posing runs something like this. Let me put it in a number of different ways so you see really what the power of this argument is. In 1976, they had in New York the first International Scholars Conference on the Holocaust. It was held in the Carnegie Institute for Peace across the street from the United Nations. And I was there. And one of the people got up to give a paper on the moral issues of the Holocaust. And this is the way this person started. Because everybody, by then it was the third day, was sort of half asleep. He wanted to wake everybody up. So he said, started like this. The Nazis didn't do anything morally wrong.
It woke everybody up.
That woke everybody up right away. Better than 20 cups of coffee, everybody was up. You know, they slept through all the other papers. This one they listened to. And he said, if you accept the theory, the social theory, that a society determines what is morally right and what is morally wrong, then within the framework of the society of Nazi Germany, in terms of their value system, where genocide against certain groups, like Jews and Slavs and Gypsies, was considered not only not morally wrong, but to the contrary, a moral virtue, because it was cleansing the world of all of these, undesirable people, then in Nazi Germany, genocide was a virtue. And not committing genocide was a moral vice. And if you look at the transcripts of the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1960-61, this is exactly one of the arguments that Eichmann brought in his own defense. Namely, he said, I didn't do anything wrong. I just followed the orders. And the orders reflected the mores, that's where the word moral comes from, more, namely the customs. The word ethics comes from ethos, same idea. The ethos, the atmosphere, just reflected the mores of the society in which I lived, Eichmann said. So therefore, how can, if that's what morality is, following the dictates of the society in terms of what it defines as good, then how can you find me guilty? How can you say I did something wrong? Now, the argument against that is that although on certain kinds of issues we cannot argue that there is a universal morality, say, for example, I don't know if you'll agree with this example, say whether in the example you gave me before the class, in business transactions in certain countries, giving a little gift is part of the transaction. In other countries, it's illegal. It's called a bribe. So you could say, well, you follow the custom of the country and you do business there the way they do business there. So there you follow the custom, the mores of the country, but there are certain things that are universally morally wrong. One of them is genocide. The whole concept of international law, for example, rests on the idea that certain things, not very many they list, but certain things are universally wrong. One of them happens to be genocide. You can't say genocide is rational. You can't justify it rationally. You can't justify it intuitively. You can't justify it emotionally. Today I feel like doing a genocide. Makes me feel good. And you can't justify it on the basis of social theory.
Didn't the United Nations do something about
The United Nations has a genocide treaty. The United States was one of the last countries to sign it because the United States was afraid that we would be accused in Vietnam of having committed genocide, and if we didn't sign it, we couldn't be accused. So the United States, even though it introduced the genocide treaty into the UN, was one of the last to sign it. And the term genocide, by the way, interestingly enough, did not exist during the Holocaust. It was invented right after the Holocaust by a Polish Jewish lawyer named Ralph Lemkin, who was one of the lawyers preparing for the Nuremberg trials, the documents for the Nuremberg trials. And he decided that it's not simply enough to say that the Holocaust was a crime against humanity or a war crime, which were categories they had left over from World War I, but that it was something even more. And so he defined this term, he made this term the killing of a whole gene, the killing of a race, killing of a whole people. And that's where the term genocide came from. So you can say, well, there are many things that are culturally determined in terms of whether they're moral or not, But we have to admit there are certain things that we can't simply say they're a matter of cultural preference. Yes.
That's a culturally preferenced statement, I think. I mean, within the context of this theory, that's spoken like an American, looking at from our culturally, how's this argument? Our culturally derived morality, looking at another culture's morality and making a judgment upon it. And then making an absolute judgment upon it. Maybe what we could say is our culture, or the Western culture, the alliance culture of World War II, looked at the German culture, found it lacking. They won the war, so they imposed their values on it. There wasn't anything tighter.
Well, you're making the argument Jean Paul Sartre made when he said the victors write history, which is, of course, true.
But where I wanted to go with this is saying that one of the problems with this whole theory is defining how do you draw a box around a culture. I mean, this could get very, very small down to a family unit. It could be in a city within a larger culture. You could have, I mean, the whole idea of multiculturalism within a society, part of what defines a subgroup would be some of the their ethical beliefs. So what I think is a bigger issue, another issue with this, which doesn't require you to create an absolutist view without an absolutist foundation, is to say there's no way to define the culture and to keep subdividing to the point that you almost can't make a statement.
Well, I'm not trying to make an absolutist view on everything. I'm just trying to make an absolutist view on certain things. So, which fork I use, I don't really care. If I use the wrong fork, they're not going to shoot me. But
Well,
some culture might. But I would say genocide, we can make we can't assume that this is an imposition of an American culture to say genocide is wrong. I think everybody would agree that genocide is wrong. Even those who do it would agree it's wrong if it were directed against them. And to say it's an American bias, we have to, think about it a little further. For example, I could make a very good argument, I don't want to get into this argument here, that the Americans did the genocide before the Germans. Just different victims.
The Indians?
The Indians. It was a government policy, just like Nazi Germany. It was connected to the idea of space, living space. We called it manifest destiny. They called it Lebensraum. Same, more or less the same idea. You had the phrase in Germany, the only good Jew is a dead Jew. You had the phrase in America, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. I mean, I could draw millions of parallels. So I could say, we have to then condemn ourselves. Tell you an interesting thing, and I don't want to get too far afield here. There was a movie made for television that was on last year about the prisoner of war camp, Confederate prisoner of war camp during the Civil War, Andersonville. And this movie was based on a novel that won the Pulitzer Prize by McKinley Cantor. Now, what most people don't know is that McKinley Cantor based his information on Andersonville. I mean, how did he come to what Andersonville was?
Diaries, letters.
But how did he have a visual description of Andersonville? His visual description of Andersonville is based upon what he saw when he was an American soldier liberating the Nazi camps. There was an interview with Cantor, and he said this. So there is a direct link there to the Holocaust. Now, the interesting thing about Andersonville, it's the only example in American history of a war crimes trial. It's the only one we ever had, that somebody was put on trial for war crimes, and that was Major Wirtz, who was the commandant of Andersonville. So we do have it already, in our culture before the war, before Germany, that certain kinds of actions are not morally justified. I happened to mention this in a class many years ago. A student raised her hand, and she said, "You got it all wrong." I said, "What do you mean I got it all wrong?" It ended up that she was the great-great-granddaughter of Wirtz.
Really?
Really, she was the great-great-granddaughter of Colonel Wirtz.
Did you concede that genocide was universal?
Universally wrong.
Yeah.
Yes, I would.
Then flunk the test for social theory.
Right, that's the whole idea. In other words, if you have a theory and you have one exception to the theory, then the theory is not totally valid.
But if you have one that's universal, there has to, I would presume there would have to be others. That
Right.
logical.
Right, but I'm not now trying to find the others. I just want to give an example of the holes in the social theory. Now, these four approaches, which are characteristic of Western philosophical ethics, or if you will, of secular ethics, share three premises in common, all of which differentiates it from Jewish ethics. The first assumption all of these four approaches make, that Jewish ethics doesn't make, as we'll see, is that ethics is ultimately grounded in subjective human criteria. In this case, rationality, emotion, intuition, so forth. Secondly, it assumes, it's almost the same as the first, that ethics are autonomous. We discussed last week Kant's theory about moral autonomy. Namely, that ethics derive solely from autonomous human origins. In other words, not from any objective origin, like from God or something like this, or not from any supernatural origin. And the third thing all of them have in common is that in each of their views, ethical decision-making is exclusionary rather than inclusionary. In other words, the rational says you have to make moral decisions rationally, not emotionally, not intuitively, not based on what the society says. The intuitionist, as we saw, and the emotionist, the emotive, are reactions to the rational. So they're, in a sense, excluding the rational. Whereas, as we'll see, Jewish ethics has a different point of view. Now, how does Jewish ethics have a different point of view? First of all, Jewish ethics, or as we were discussing it last week, ethics of Judaism. Judaism is a religion. A religion has a theology. Jewish ethics are the ethics of Judaism. Therefore, they are what we would call a theological ethic. In other words, it is an ethical system based on certain theological assumptions. And we'll see in a few minutes what some of those theological assumptions are. In other words, the idea is that ethics is not, from the point of view of Jewish ethics, based on human autonomy or based on human subjectivity, but it is based on certain theological assumptions, the most primary of which is the existence of a supernatural being known by many names, amongst them God. And I'll get back to this in a few minutes. The second thing is that Jewish ethics is not exclusionary but is inclusionary. Because on the one hand, Jewish ethics sees ethics based on certain, let us say, objective realities, including certain theological premises and the existence of a certain tradition that exists as a historical phenomenon, in this case Jewish tradition, and also is based on certain subjective criteria. which include all of the criteria we already mentioned, namely the rational, the emotive, the intuitionist, and the social. In other words, say you have an objective rule. Say, thou shalt not murder. That's the rule. That's an objective rule based on certain theological premises. I'll get in a minute to what they are. But then it's not so simple. Then you have to ask certain subjective issues, questions. When does that rule apply? How is that rule interpreted? In certain specific kinds of situations, how does that rule play out? And to answer that, you have to bring into play all of these criteria. In other words, what I'm simply arguing here is that in these four approaches, that it seems to me characterize the approach of Western philosophical ethics, it's an either-or possibility. It's an either-or situation. Either you decide what is moral this way, this way, this way, or this way. And they're all essentially autonomous human things. But what I'm suggesting is that Jewish ethics is richer because it includes all of these, but says even if you include all of these, even if you bring all of these factors into making a moral decision, that's not enough. You also have to have a counterbalance or a check and balance with this. So the moral decision-making process for Jewish ethics contains this and this. And we'll see in a while how this all plays out.
I don't want to go back to something, but the first three, rational, emotional, intuitive, are human characteristics, are people characteristics.
Yes.
But social, doesn't that, you said that Eichmann said he followed his leaders, the route.
Right.
Where did that come from? Did they get permission from the people? Who decided what was socially good and what was socially bad? That hasn't come from an individual. It did come from, so therefore we don't need the fourth one if it comes out of the other three.
I'm just reporting historically what developed. I'm not making these up.
I know, but
But in terms of your question, what one could argue is, following Aristotle, that the human being is a social animal. Therefore, the human being has to live in some kind of social environment. And that social environment would determine for that person what is morally right and what is morally wrong.
who decides what socially is? Who decides that? Was it the Nazis that
The
decided?
people decide. The group
The
decides.
people are rational, emotional, intuitive.
No, the people may be none. None of the above or all of the above.
All right. You're only reporting.
I'm only reporting. Don't shoot the messenger.
Is that responsible?
Look, let me give you a rather bizarre example. Have you ever been to a Bulls game?
Certainly.
I mean, you go there, the United Center, it's absolute, pandemonium. It's like, a religious revival, especially if they're winning, which of course they always do. Why are people all committed to this?
That's what I've asked myself.
Yeah, me too.
I mean, what is the basis of all this?
People throw the ball into a basket and make 25 million
Yeah, really.
while leaders, scientists, researchers who find cures for diseases have to struggle.
The one guy produces more happiness.
Well, ask Aristotle.
Exciting.
See, I can ask you the same question. Everybody who goes makes an individual decision to be part of this. Am I going to say it's, comes from the city? Is it coming from television? Everybody who goes makes that decision. Or let me give you an example of, say, not rational. Have you been to Wrigley Field?
Already, you're in the irrational.
Do I have to?
People are rooting. No, I'm just giving it as a hypothetical example. I mean, there are people there every game rooting. You know, they expect some winning to go on there. Miracle. There hasn't been a World Series won by them since 1908. You know, this is the classic example of hope despite experience. Is this rational? Rationality is usually based on some previous thing you assume is going to happen again. It hasn't happened since 1908. But it happened, but not since 1908. It'll happen again. But is it a rational thing? So the people who are going, it's an individual decision to go, even though it's a kind of social structure. Maybe the people choose the social structure they're in.
That was my question, yes.
I said maybe sometimes not. It's not a simple question. I'm just, trying to outline these four positions and to demonstrate that in themselves, the four positions, each of them are problematic. Yes,
It's a
sir.
little bit elitist. I don't think
It's not a sin to be elitist. Let me reveal my position right away. Pardon me?
When we're talking about morality and everything, there are leaders that choose for them. In Germany, it wasn't the people that chose to do that. There was leaders and the people who were sheep that went with them.
Look. Hitler was elected by a greater majority than Clinton.
That is right.
And you take, when Clinton...
Or Nixon, or whoever you want.
Half of them wouldn't know what any position he had.
Well, why bring politics into this?
I mean, don't assume that Nazi Germany just came into being, by chance.
I'm not assuming there is.
It was a democratically elected government in the beginning, and the number of people voting for the Nazi Party is greater than most percentages of American positions of elected officials.
So most of the philosophers that you have quoted so far were elitist and didn't give...
I told you it's not a sin.
Well, but
Only in the politically correct culture it's a sin. I'm not part of that
did
culture.
not give the status to the individual that you're giving on the
What's the status I'm giving?
status.
What am I giving?
There's that much, that individuals have that much choice,
Well,
or even
should have choice. They shouldn't have choice. You see, the premise I'm working on is the premise I began with tonight. If we don't assume that people aren't moral agents, we might as well pack up and go home, because then in discussing ethics, there's nothing to discuss. If we can't assume that people have certain choices, there's nothing to discuss. And I don't see it as a matter of an elitist issue. It's a matter of, does a person have the choice or don't they have the choice? And if they don't have the choice, they can't be responsible for what happens. And then you get to the question, so who is responsible? See, if you try to pin the rap always on the leaders, this is exactly what the Nuremberg trials tried to do. Pin the rap on the leaders. So they said, well, it wasn't the generals, they weren't responsible, the government leaders weren't responsible, only Hitler was responsible and he killed himself. So no one is responsible. That's the danger in this. All right, so let's get back to this idea of theological ethics. The ethics of Judaism, or Jewish ethics, as I tried to outline, is a form of not secular ethics, but rather of religious ethics, or theological ethics. And as a theological ethic, it rests on certain theological premises. And I'll have more to say about this later, but let me now focus on a number of those theological premises. I'm not saying you have to accept these premises or not accept these premises, or that that's your business. But I'm saying if you look at the classical literature, classical Jewish literature, this is the position that literature takes. The first premise underlying, I would say, all of Judaism and certainly Jewish ethics, is the premise that there is a God who exists. Now, if you look, for example, at certain rabbinic texts, you see that they link this premise to certain ethical concerns. And I'll give you just, for now, 2 examples. One example you have in a rabbinic text, probably 2nd or 3rd century, called in the Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael, which is a commentary on the book of Exodus. In there, they have a commentary on the 10 Commandments, which is in chapter 20 in the book of Exodus. And they say like this: if you look at the 10 Commandments, you see that they're on 2 tablets, 5 on each. And I'm not going to go through the whole explanation, but they say they come in pairs. In other words, that one on the first tablet is juxtaposed to another one on the second tablet, and that there is a relationship between the 2. So in their way of counting the 10 Commandments, the first commandment is, I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt. And the counterpart to that, on the second tablet, would be number what? 6. You have 5 here and 5 here. And number 6, in the way the rabbis counted, Christians counted differently, is what? Shouldn't murder. It's not you shouldn't kill, it's you shouldn't murder. All right? So they said the placement is not by chance. In other words, they argue like this: you shall not murder. Why? Because I am the Lord your God. In other words, it's not because it's rational, not because it's emotional, intuitional, or societal. Why shouldn't a person murder? Because there is a God. In other words, that the idea that there is a God who exists as a kind of guarantor of a moral scheme, as a God who has a certain purpose and plan for human existence, as a God who has introduced certain moral norms into the universe to make life meaningful, that there is a relationship between not murdering and the fact that there is a God. In other words, if I take any of these approaches, I can, on the basis of any of those approaches, justify murder. We're not talking here about killing in self-defense or anything like this. Simple, cold-blooded, premeditated murder. So the argument here would be, none of those approaches can convince me not to murder. I could justify it and say it's rational. I could say it's emotive, I happen to feel like it now. I can use any of those arguments to justify murder. But what is the thing that I can't argue against if I accept the premise? And their argument is it's this: if you assume the existence of a God, and a certain kind of God, of course, then, therefore, because you assume that, you shouldn't murder. Let me give now the second example. The second example is from a rabbinic text called the Avot de Rabbi Natan. Some of you may have heard of the Ethics of the Fathers, the Pirkei Avot. This is a rabbinic commentary on it. The Avot according to Rabbi Nathan. And in there you find the following translation of a verse you all know from the book of Leviticus. The verse is, you should love your neighbor as yourself. We're going to discuss this verse in some detail in future weeks. You should love your neighbor as yourself. Why? Is it rational? Are you going to feel like it? Most people not. Now, what most people don't quote, this isn't the whole verse. There's a second part to the verse. What's the second part to the verse? I am the Lord your God. And the Avot de Rabbi Natan translates it this way. They just make one little change, or one little interpretation. You should love your neighbor, I left out. Love your neighbor as yourself, because I am the Lord your God. That's their interpretation, that's their translation. In other words, why should you love the neighbor as the self? None of these hold up, because I am the Lord your God. In other words, if you assume the existence of God, and that God has certain qualities, that's why you should love the neighbor as yourself. In other words, it's an objective requirement, not based on any autonomous, not based on any subjective, but rather based on the theological assumption that God exists. Now, connected to this is another idea which we will discuss in greater detail when we get to topic 2 on the human nature, and that is the second theological premise. The first theological premise is God exists. The second premise is based on a verse that appears in Genesis. You all know it. In the creation story, the first chapter of Genesis, that the human being is created in God's image. In other words, the argument here is that because the human being is created in God's image, certain kinds of behavior are morally right, and certain kinds of behavior are morally wrong. What we have to discuss later on, I'm not going to do it now, is what is the meaning of this term, God's image? That's a whole other business. But the argument here is that because the human being is created, assumed to be created in the image of God, simply because of that claim, certain kinds of actions are considered morally right and certain actions morally wrong. In other words, certain actions are in accordance or correlative with or agree with the fact that the human being is created in God's image, and other kinds of actions would not be compatible with that. So again here, they use this to justify the prohibition against murder. Why shouldn't a person murder? Because murdering another person who is created in the image of God is like murdering God. You have such a rabbinic statement. So again, it gives you an objective position. It's not a question of what you want to rationalize, not a question of emotion, not a question of anything else. Beginning in the 16th century, particularly amongst the Jewish mystics, they go one step further than this. You have this idea the human being is created in the image of God around for thousands of years, and all of a sudden in the 16th century, an idea pops in or develops in Jewish mysticism that changes the script on Jewish ethics, at least amongst the Jewish mystics. Not everybody accepted it. And here's the idea. The idea is that the essence of the human being is the soul. That's not the new idea. The new idea is the second part. And the second part is that the human soul, which is the essence of the human being, is, and they use a term in Hebrew from the book of Job. In Hebrew, it's chelek Eloha mima'al, a part or a portion of God from above. In other words, here the idea develops that the essence of the human being is the soul, and that the soul is actually a part of God. Not simply created in the image of God, but actually a part of God, divine. One of the analogies they give is that God is like a big fire, and that each human soul is like a spark of that fire. Therefore, how a person treats themselves, how a person treats another person, is not simply should be a certain way because they're in the image of God, but because they are essentially part of God. And therefore, what the person is doing is not, if they do something wrong, is not an affront against another person simply, but also an affront against God. Also in the 16th century, an idea begins to develop, and if you want, I can give you all the sources if you're interested. But an idea begins to develop in Jewish ethical writing that ethics has three different components, or three different aspects. It's all based on interpretation of a statement in the Talmud. If you want it, I'll give it to you. And that is that ethics relates to the human being's relationship with his or her own self, the human being's relationship with another person, with others, and the human being's relationship with God. In other words, that ethics includes not simply how we relate to other people, it's not simply social ethics, but it also relates to how a person relates to themselves. Developing, for example, moral virtues can relate only to the self, need not necessarily also relate to others. And you have here the idea that part of the moral sphere, so to speak, is the relationship between the human being and God. That, again, is a theological premise. Namely, you can't have ethics without also relating not simply to others, or not simply to the social sphere, but also to the self, and not also to God. In other words, that every action you do against yourself or against another person is also an action that is either morally virtuous or morally not virtuous vis-a-vis the divine. Another assumption, which should already be clear, is that for the ethics of Judaism, ethics is not rooted in the autonomous self or in societal norms, but rather in, and here you have a very clear theological premise, in an act of revelation. In other words, that God somehow has revealed to us his will in terms of what is morally right and what is morally wrong. So, for example, when you have the example I gave before of the Ten Commandments, what are Ten Commandments? This is given through an act of revelation. Just didn't, come through an email or something like this. So the assumption is that there is an act of revelation. God somehow reveals the divine will. In Judaism, God rarely reveals himself, only his will. Reveals his will to us. And in that will is what is morally right and what is morally wrong. So whether how you interpret the act of revelation, what you want to say was given in the act of revelation, these are other issues. But the theological assumption upon which the ethics of Judaism is based is that there was an act of revelation, and that somehow in that act of revelation certain moral norms were conveyed. That then leads to the next assumption, which is a very important assumption, because if we have the revelation, the next question is, what do we do with it? And that is the assumption that there is a process, an ongoing process of interpretation that goes along with this revelation. In other words, the assumption is that the tradition, as it develops, is the interpretation of what is the meaning of the revelation. And that process of interpretation in terms of morality interprets for us what the revelation means in terms of what is considered morally right and what is considered morally wrong. And here I have to interject a statement you might find a little shocking, and that is that from this perspective, Judaism is not the Bible. The biblical statements in the Bible on you should do this or that or ethics or this are irrelevant. What's relevant here is how the tradition has interpreted those statements. In other words, how the tradition interprets those statements, what the tradition finds those statements to mean, that's what the revelation means. You might want to interpret it another way. Some other tradition might want to interpret it another way. But Judaism is how the tradition of Judaism has interpreted that text, which is considered to be the revealed text. That's why I discussed with you last week why there can't be such a thing as a Judeo-Christian ethic. Because the Jewish tradition of interpretation of the same biblical text as the Christian tradition of interpretation is totally different. So for example, I mean, I could give you a million examples. One example is the Christian interpretation, say, of the sixth commandment that I mentioned before, is that it doesn't mean you shouldn't murder, it means you shouldn't kill, and that includes abortion. No Jewish exegete took the sixth commandment to prohibit abortion. But already in St. Augustine, you have a prohibition against abortion as an interpretation of that. So if you interpret a text in different ways, the text is a different text, because it means something totally different. Now, let me give you another example, because people don't like to accept this idea that a tradition has the authority to interpret what a text means. But all of us assume this if you look at the American Constitution. The American Constitution is not what it says. The text of the Constitution has nothing to do with what is constitutional. It's how it has been interpreted by the tradition of constitutional interpretation, by this authority, namely the Supreme Court. You can interpret it whatever way you want, doesn't mean anything. How they interpreted it over time is what it means. And what they interpret it to mean becomes what it means. So let me give you a simple example. Suppose the president gets up one day and says, I want to establish a state religion, whatever it might be. Say, Tipperism. I want to make Tipperism the state religion, or Hillaryism, or something like this. That's going to be the state religion. Can he do it constitutionally?
No.
Why not?
First Amendment.
First Amendment says nothing about the president. It's not in the Constitution. First of all, the First Amendment is an amendment. It's not in the Constitution, it's an amendment. So already if you're assuming that an amendment has the same authority as what's in the Constitution, you're already making an interpretation. All right? You have civil rights law today, right? You can't discriminate on the basis of race, yet in the Constitution, African Americans have no rights. In the text of the Constitution, it says so.
Where does it say?
In the text of the Constitution, it says so. It says there's slavery, that's some of them.
Peculiar institution.
Pardon me?
Right. It's called a peculiar institution.
Peculiar, whatever kind of institution. The people who wrote it, a lot of them had them, including Jefferson. But it's not there. And you're saying the First Amendment is like the text of the Constitution, that's also an interpretation. And saying that the text of the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law about religion. It doesn't say the president can't. But the process of interpretation has come that the statement Congress means the government, the federal government can't. Now, suppose the governor got up one day and said, I want to make a state religion in Illinois. Federal Constitution is talking about the federal government. It's not talking about the states. But you have a process of interpretation. And the interpretation becomes incorporated into the text and becomes what the text means. I don't know if you thought about that.
Then in other words, what you're saying is that anything can be done. There are no limitations.
That's
There's
right.
No, I'm not saying anything can be done. I'm saying that anything can be done within a certain structure. For example, nobody can come and say that it would be constitutional to have a king of the United States. They can't have a king. Can't have it in the Constitution. Or that a state should have 5 senators and another state should have 1 senator. There is a certain structure. And this process of interpretation defines what is that structure. Now, Constitution is based on the assumption, when you say something is constitutional, is based on the assumption that a document written a little over 200 years ago has something to say or is somehow pertinent to what we're doing now. So if you have a discussion about say, air rights or fiber optics, and it goes to the Supreme Court and they have to decide what's the constitutional position, the assumption is that somehow the Constitution already figured out something about this. In other words, that it's already anticipated by the text of the Constitution. Otherwise, what do you mean by constitutional? And that's only 200 years ago. The assumption being made throughout Jewish tradition is that all of these ancient texts, and from our point of view also medieval texts, hundreds of years old, can somehow be applied to the situations today. So in other words, when you are in the process of making moral decisions in Judaism, what you are doing is you're saying, all of this is rooted in a primary document, the Torah, the Bible. That primary document somehow comes through an act of revelation. That's one of your assumptions. But that document, in terms of what it means and in terms of how it applies to certain situations now, applies through a process of interpretation which has certain parameters and certain limits and certain means of interpretation. In other words, you can't even use every means of interpretation you want. You have to use certain means that are developed by the tradition. Just like in American law, you have a witness on the stand. You want to decide whether the defendant is guilty or not. You have to decide by the laws of evidence, by the rules of evidence, that have developed in this country. You can't decide by, say, rules of evidence of another country or another legal system. You're making decision and interpretation within the boundaries of that decision. And that decision, that process of interpretation, becomes what the text means. So in other words, if the Supreme Court decides this is what the Constitution means, even though you won't find it anywhere there, and that decision is accepted by the people, that's what the Constitution means, even though it may not have originally been what it said or meant. Take civil rights legislation. Where is that in the Constitution? You can't discriminate on the basis of race. Where is that in the Constitution?
15th Amendment.
But that's already an amendment. And the amendment didn't have a civil rights law in it. You needed a civil rights legislation in 64? How can you say the civil rights legislation is constitutional? How did they argue it's constitutional, do you know? They had to find something in the Constitution to say that it's constitutional, even though they knew that it's not in the Constitution.
What did they find?
They found the Interstate Commerce Clause. And the whole civil rights legislation is hung on that. Because the federal government has the right to regulate interstate commerce. So a black lady was on a bus, and the bus happened to operate across state lines, and that gave the federal government jurisdiction to look into this, and they made the civil rights legislation. And now we assume that this is constitutional. In other words, it's unconstitutional to discriminate on the basis of race and religion and this and this. We say this is what the Constitution says, but it's not there. But we say it because that's how the process of interpretation went. Or for example, in Jewish law, you have a verse, you shall not see the kid in its mother's milk. What does it mean? It means that according to Jewish dietary laws, you have two sets of dishes and two sets of silverware, and you separate meat and milk products. Where does it say that in the verse? It doesn't. It just says you shouldn't see the kid in its mother's milk. But the interpretation of this is this, that in the Jewish dietary laws you have a separation of meat and milk, and that's what the verse means, because that's how the process of interpretation took the verse to mean. Is chicken a meat or a milk? In the first century, there was an opinion it was not a meat. that fowl wasn't meat. But the process of interpretation now has defined it as a form of meat. What about fish? Fish isn't a form of meat. That's how the process of interpretation went. So the process of interpretation over a long period of time becomes integrated into the text. And that's what it means. In other words, the interpretation becomes the meaning. So when we talk about Jewish ethics, we're talking about an objective event, namely revelation. If you want to accept it or not, your business. And we're talking about an objective entity called, for want of a better term, the tradition, or the process of interpretation, if you want, which is documentable. There is a literature that exists. It's there, it's an objective reality. And that determines what the tradition has to say on different issues. So if we want to see if an issue is ethical, in terms of the ethics of Judaism, we have to look at the theological premises, we have to look at the framework, and we have to look at how that has been interpreted by the tradition. And then we see what we come up with. Get it?
In these 6 premises, there's nothing distinctly Jewish. In other words, you could say the same thing for a Muslim ethical tradition or for a Christian ethical tradition. So it's different from the Western secular tradition, but you could make that same speech in a Catholic seminary, for instance.
I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure. Because even though the points may be the same, what they mean would be different, so they're not the same points. And especially the 6th point. Let me give you an example, and you have it in the reading packet. The American Catholic bishops wrote a pastoral letter on the economy. And a book came out. I was asked to contribute an article on a Jewish view of the bishop's pastoral letter on the economy. It's in the reading packet, so you can look at it. And one of the points I'm making there, sort of as an outsider looking in, and as a person who has studied classical Catholic thought and scholastic thought, is that the thing that amazed me in reading it, the bishop's pastoral letter, was that they quoted as authorities only one of, and in a buried footnote of a few hundred footnotes, none of the medieval scholastic Catholic philosophers. They quoted the recent few popes' letters on this, or statements on this, the Vatican Council statements on this, as if the Catholic Church started with the Vatican Council, Second Vatican Council. So in other words, it seemed to me a kind of rejection of their whole tradition. Starting with the Vatican Council in the 1960s, what about everything that came before? If you read Catholic documents before the Second Vatican Council, they would always be quoting Aquinas and Augustine and Saint this guy in the Middle Ages and that guy. And there you don't have it. Now, the Protestants have an even worse problem, because Protestantism itself only begins in the 16th century. And the Protestants have a problem of what is tradition. And they have an even worse problem, and that is the problem of the idea of individuality, which is very strong in Protestantism. So I remember, for example, a number of years ago, there was a conference here at the University of Illinois in honor of the late Professor Paul Ramsey, who sort of was the person who started the whole field of medical ethics in America, and actually in the world, because it started here. And they had people giving papers there from all different traditions. So the first paper was given by the late Father Connery, who was a Jesuit at Loyola University, a very great expert in Catholic medical ethics. So he gave his paper on Catholic medical ethics. And then I was there as a Jewish representative, I got Jewish medical ethics. And then the Protestant guy got up, and he said, after listening to the Catholic view and listening to the Jewish view, I realized what a problem we have. Here you have these old and rich traditions that can glean from all of these sources, already thought out all these problems, and have a tradition to relate to these problems. And we're starting from scratch. We don't have a tradition of dealing with these problems. We don't have methods of dealing with these problems. We're really in trouble. This was an evangelical, by the way, evangelical Protestant. So I wouldn't say that each group can say all this. Now, say the other premise that I didn't put on here, but which I mentioned enough times I didn't want to put on here again, is the premise of moral volition. In certain, say, Muslim traditions, you wouldn't be able to assume this. For instance, if you say, Allah, God, decrees everything that happens, what does Islam mean? Submission to the will of God. That's what Islam means, submission. So if God, or Allah, decrees everything, and this is a problem in Islamic jurisprudence, a person is arrested for murder. How do you plead? Not guilty. But we saw you do it. Allah told me to. Allah willed it. Or it was fate, kismet. What's the comeback? There's no comeback. So this assumes the idea also of, and this we're going to discuss later in terms of the divine image. This is one of the meanings divine image of God has, as Jewish interpreters or exegetes have interpreted it. It means that just as God is a free moral agent, so are human beings. Because otherwise morality is meaningless. So in a way you're right, but in a way you're not. Because even the first premise, God exists, I mentioned when I put that on the board that it means a certain kind of God exists. So the Jewish God and the God you find in certain Christian traditions is a little different. So even though it looks at the surface that it would work that way, it really doesn't work that way. Okay, are there any questions to this point? Any comments to this point? Is everything clear? Okay, then we'll take a little break now, and when we come back, I want to discuss a little more this issue of interpreting the tradition, because how we interpret the tradition as it impacts on ethical issues is, in a nutshell, an answer to the question, how do you in fact do Jewish ethics? How do you in fact make ethical decisions within Judaism? Now, before we can address the question of what the process of interpretation one might follow in ethical decision-making in Jewish ethics, is what are the resources that one uses in that process of ethical decision-making. And I want to give you a kind of, again, nutshell answer, and then I'll flesh it out a little more when we get to particular ethical issues, and you'll see exactly what some of these sources are. But now just generally, what resources do we use? You can portray, let me put it another way, your resources are all of Jewish tradition. The assumption is that the wisdom of the past somehow applies to the moral perplexities of the present. And that if you utilize these resources through certain methods, then you can come to certain kinds of conclusions or to certain kinds of decisions in ethical decision-making. And that both those methods and those resources are found within the tradition. Now, in terms of what is the tradition, one can view it as a kind of series of concentric circles. In the middle of the series of concentric circles, you would have the Bible or the scriptures. So that's in the middle. And then you begin the process of the interpretation of what that means, and that leads you to the next big circle around that, which is, say, rabbinic literature. The literature of the Talmudic rabbis. So you're already up now until maybe the 6th or 7th century. So you already have about 2,000 years. Then the next big circle around that is medieval Jewish literature. And in terms of ethical issues, you find it in the legal literature of the Middle Ages, because in Jewish law you find the concretization of decisions about a lot of ethical issues. You find it in the philosophical and mystical traditions developing in medieval Judaism. Jewish philosophy really begins in the Middle Ages. Jewish mysticism begins its flowering in the Middle Ages. But you find it also, or I would say more directly, in a genre of medieval Jewish literature that is really begins in the Middle Ages and then develops from there. And this literature is called in Hebrew the Sifrut HaMusar, or ethical literature. And I'm going to say a word about that in a minute, what it is. And then you have the final circle, which is the literature of the modern period. So there you have, in a nutshell, all of the literary resources that you would need to make, or to have the foundation for making an ethical decision. Then the question is, once you have all the resources, the raw materials, then the question is the method. How do you then use them in the process of decision making? That's a separate issue. But here I'm just trying to outline very simply what resources you have to draw on for raw materials in terms of making an ethical decision. Let me give you a kind of analogy to this that you find within one rabbinic text, a late midrash. A story is told there about a king, and the king had 2 servants. He had more than 2 servants, but for this story he only has 2 servants. And in the morning he goes to each of these 2 servants, and he says to each of them, I'm going off, to do whatever a king does during the day, and I'm giving each of you a job. The job is, I'm going to give you each certain things. I want you to take care of these things while I'm away during the day. And he gives each of them the same things. He gives each of them a bundle of grapes, a bundle of flax, and a bundle of wheat. And he says, I want you to take care of this while I'm away for the day. I'll be back at the end of the day, and I want to see what happens to these things. But you have to take care of them. So the king goes away for the day. He comes back at the end of the day. Goes to the first servant. He says to the servant, remember those things I gave you this morning? What's happened to them? First servant says, Majesty, I have guarded them with my life all day. And here they are, just as you gave it to me. And he gives the king back exactly what he gave him, the same bundle of grapes, bundle of flax, and bundle of wheat. King says, thank you very much. Goes then to the second servant. He says to the servant, what did you do with the stuff I gave you this morning? Did you guard it? And the second servant says, has a table and a chair in his house. He says, Majesty, sit down. The king sits down, and he brings over a beautiful linen tablecloth, puts it on the table. Then he brings over a big, very good smelling loaf of bread, puts it on the tablecloth. And then he brings over a goblet of wine, very good wine. And the king says, what's this? And the servant says, well, while you were away all day, I took the flax and I made it into this linen tablecloth. I took these grapes, and I made it into this wine. And I took this wheat and I made it into this bread. And so the king sat and he ate and was happy. And the text ends with the rhetorical question, with which of the two servants was the king more happy? And the answer is the second. In other words, the idea is that the tradition, these resources, literary resources, which are based on thought and experience of Jews for thousands of years, these are the raw materials. Then you have the process of translating those raw materials into concrete ethical decisions. That's the second servant. In other words, the idea is that with the raw materials of tradition rooted in revelation, what God wants us to do is to apply these methods and to use our human talents, use our reason, use our emotion, use our intuition in order to translate these and apply these to the situations and the moral problems that perplex us. And later on I will discuss the whole question of some of the methods. But now I want to focus on what is this new genre called Jewish ethical literature that emerged in the Middle Ages. In the two earlier periods in Jewish history, before the Middle Ages, namely the biblical period of the scriptures, and in the rabbinic period, the period of the Talmud, you do not find an ethical literature per se. In other words, you don't find, for example, ethical treatises. You don't really even have a term for ethics. This term musar comes from the root yasar, which you find very often in the book of Proverbs, for example, but it doesn't there mean ethics. It means instruction or admonition. It doesn't mean ethics per se. And the idea of ethical values, in Hebrew the word for values is midot, or in the singular midah, comes to be used in the Middle Ages. It becomes common in the Middle Ages to refer to an ethical value. Midah comes from the root, something you weigh, namely something that has weight. But in the Middle Ages, all of a sudden, you have an explosion of this new genre called Jewish ethical literature. And the question is, what is it and why? Why did it emerge? Yeah.
Isn't the rabbinic literature full of discussions that you would call ethical?
It's full of them, but it's not organized. You have, for example, a tractate in the Talmud on, say, Passover, or a tractate on Yom Kippur. You don't really have a tractate on ethics. Now, you might say, well, you have the Pirkei Avot, the ethics of the fathers. But the ethics of the fathers are really not on ethics. The ethics of the fathers were probably an instruction manual to judges. And in fact, if you look at the Hebrew term for it, which is always translated the ethics of the fathers, the Pirkei Avot, neither of those two terms mean ethics. And it's usually translated the ethics of the fathers. Avot means fathers, all right? Pirkei means the sections. The original meaning of perek, the singular, is a joint on a finger. But later it came to mean a chapter because it's like a section of a book. So you could say it's the chapters of the fathers. Question is, does avot here mean fathers? In one commentary it says it doesn't. Because one of the meanings of the term avot in rabbinic Hebrew, you find it in the Talmud all the time, is av, which literally means father, avot, the plural, fathers, also means principles. So another way to translate it, you never hear it, but the commentaries on this themselves translate it this way, the chapters of principles. Not really having to do with ethics. Or you could say, well, already in the Bible you have a lot of statements on ethics, for sure. But you don't find them like developed in one book. You have Genesis, Exodus, so forth, but you don't have a book of ethics. And this is exactly one of the things that this Sifrut HaMusar, the medieval literature, did. It tried to collect and organize all of the statements in the Bible and Talmud about ethics in an organized way. So say all the statements on repentance in the one book or one chapter of one book. This was a new idea. Until then, they were all scattered. And it wasn't clear what it meant, what the relationship of the different statements was. But the development of the ethical literature really raises the question that is the key question in Jewish ethics altogether. Namely, why was it needed? What was it trying to accomplish? But let me put it another way. If we say that ethics is concerned with what a person should do and what a person should not do, namely with proper and improper human behavior, then why do we need a Jewish ethics if we already have a Jewish law telling us what we should do and what we should not do? In other words, is Jewish ethics unnecessary because we already have prescriptions in Jewish law in terms of what to do and what to not do? Is Jewish ethics superfluous if we already are told what to do and what not to do? And if it's not superfluous and not unnecessary, why is it needed as a separate genre? In other words, you have a very strong argument in the history of Judaism that Judaism is essentially a legal system. And if it's a legal system and the legal system tells you what you should do and what you shouldn't do, then why do you need a supplementary ethical system if all the questions have been answered? And this is the question of why, all of a sudden in the Middle Ages, when you already have a very well-developed Jewish legal system, why all of a sudden a Jewish ethical literature pops up? Yeah.
I would think probably because you're outside your own society dealing with foreign societies in which you're dealing in Christian or Muslim worlds, and there's the interaction.
Well, that could be, but then you'd have the problem of why didn't it pop up already in the Talmudic period, because in the last part of the Talmudic period, the Jews were already outside of their society. They were in Babylonia, they were a minority religion there, so you could say, why didn't it pop up already in the Talmudic period, earlier? Now, let me give you a number of possible answers to this. In the Talmud, in this second stratum of Jewish literature, the basic issue the Talmudic rabbis were trying to resolve was what we have to do. In other words, we had the Bible, and they're trying to interpret what the Bible means in terms of what we have to do. Because the Bible is vague about many things. In the Middle Ages, one of the major issues is what is called in Hebrew the ta'amei hamitzvot, the rationales for observance. In other words, we already know what to do, now we want to know why. And one of the things that the Sifrut HaMusar concentrates on is the question of why we do what we do. It's the question you asked before. In other words, if the Talmud says you should, say, be humble. Why? If the Talmud says there is a commandment to do repentance, why? Then you have the question of how. By how, one of the things they mean in the ethical literature is what kind of mental state, what kind of intention should you have when you do something. For example, you have a commandment in the Torah. You should, in the Ten Commandments actually, you should honor your father and mother. So the Talmud says one of the ways you do that is that if your parents are poor and don't have enough food, you should help feed them. But what if you say, come to see them every week, and you bring them food and say, here, leave me alone, eat this stuff. Are you doing the right thing, but are you doing it in the right way? So one of the things they were concerned about is how, not only that you do things, but how you do certain things. One of the first books of the Jewish medieval ethical literature, the Sifrut HaMusar, was a book written in the 12th century in Spain by Bachya ibn Pakuda. It's called The Duties of the Heart. And in there he says there are two kinds of things that are required. And the Talmud is dealing primarily with what he called the duties of the limbs. In other words, the actions. He says, but unless you also have what he calls the duties of the heart, the right intentions, the right beliefs, the right attitudes, then the actions are not enough. And what are those attitudes? What are those intentions? What are the beliefs that the actions are based on? So he adds this kind of agenda. Furthermore, in the Middle Ages, the operating assumption became that the center of Jewish authority is no longer the Bible but the Talmud. In other words, in the Middle Ages, you have the establishment of the basis of Jewish authority in not the Bible, but how the Talmudic rabbis understood the Bible. So for them, the question is, our starting point is the Talmud, but the Talmud doesn't tell us enough. We have to add more. And the question is, how do we see these old texts, the rabbinic texts and the biblical texts, in new ways that apply to our new situations? Part of the new situations was being a minority religion amongst certain other religions that they weren't amongst before, particularly Islam, which only began in the 7th century. Also, in the medieval period, you have the beginning of the flourishing of Jewish philosophy and Jewish mysticism. And the impact of Jewish philosophy and Jewish mysticism on the whole question of what is Jewish ethics. And this gets back to the question you raised before about why should a person be ethical to begin with? The philosophers had one view, mystics had another view. But the question wasn't really asked before then, because the answer was, if you ask the question in the, say, Talmudic period, why should you do this or this? Because it's a commandment. That's why. Why are you on earth? What's the purpose of human existence? To fulfill the commandments, to give glory to God through fulfillment of the commandments. But now in the Middle Ages, new answers begin to develop in response to these questions. For example, take the Jewish philosophers, the Aristotelians amongst them. Not all of them were Aristotelians, but take the Aristotelians, say like Maimonides and Ibn Dawud, say in the 12th century. Their answer to the question, influenced by Aristotle, would be, why should a person be moral? A person should be moral because each person's purpose for being on earth is to make the transition from potentiality to actuality, to actualize their potential. This is Aristotle's idea of everything. Everything that exists here is here to actualize its potential. So an acorn can either become an oak or it can remain an acorn. And an oak is a realized or an actualized acorn. An acorn is an unrealized oak tree. Human being can either realize his potential or not realize his potential. Human being can become an oak or it can remain an acorn. How does the human being realize his or her potential? One way, according to Maimonides, is through the development of the moral virtues. Then it becomes necessary to outline what they are, which he did. But in Maimonides' view, why should a person be moral? Because that's the way the person is most truly human. That's the way the person realizes his or her potential. That's the way the person becomes an oak rather than an acorn. That's his answer. Then you have the mystics, for example. One mystical school would argue, well, why should we do certain things and not do other things? Because in their view, what we do down here affects God in some way, has an effect on God, and we should be moral. Why should we be moral? Because everything we do affects God, and if we are moral, it helps God, and if we're not moral, it hurts God. So in other words, you have, say, the philosophers and the mystics advocating the same virtue, say like humility or something like this, but their reasons for it and their reasons for being moral are different. But the starting point is the same. The starting point is that simply saying we're commanded to do it and that's enough isn't enough for them. They're asking more. Why? And then they're giving answers, and this is one of the big agenda items of the ethical literature. Now, in terms of the interaction of Judaism with other traditions in the Middle Ages, the ethical literature, on the one hand, shows the difference between Jewish views or Jewish ethics and other systems. But on the other hand, the ethical literature acted as a kind of conduit for views from outside of Judaism to enter into Judaism. So, for example, Jews speaking Arabic as their first language knew a lot about the Muslim ethical literature. They knew a lot of aphorisms that were quoted in the Arab world about ethical issues. They included them in their works written in Arabic. Later, those works were translated into Hebrew, and those ideas then somehow infiltrated into Judaism. So it was not simply that on the one hand the ethical literature kept certain ideas from the outside out, it also was utilized as a catalyst to let certain ideas in. Now let me give you an example of some concrete or specific kinds or genre of the ethical literature and some examples of some of the books in it. You have most of the material in your reading, but I just want to give you a number of examples that may have slipped as you did the reading. In the medieval ethical literature, you have, for the first time, you find for the first time ethical treatises. In other words, you find for the first time actual books in classical Jewish literature on ethical issues. Many of these books take the form of, this is a book on ethical issues, say a book like the Orchot Tzadikim, the Ways of the Righteous, and the book is divided into chapters, and each chapter will deal with a different, say, moral virtue or a different moral vice. And the way they'll do it is they'll collect all of the statements, or most of the statements that are found in the Bible and in the rabbinic literature, interpreting the Bible, and then they'll weave them together to give you a portrait of their view of what the nature of that moral virtue or moral vice is. So in other words, they're building on the earlier literature and taking it one step further. Because you have, say, in the Talmud, maybe hundreds of statements about, say, what is humility. But you have no definitions. So what they will do is they will take the earlier statements and they'll weave them together in such a way as to give you a kind of portrait, not necessarily a definition, but a kind of portrait of what this concept is. Whereas in the Talmud, all you'll have is random statements, sometimes contradictory. So you have a kind of cohesiveness forming now for the first time as to what certain ethical values are, certain what ethical vices are, why you should do them, why you shouldn't do them. You have here infiltration of certain ideas from Greek philosophy, certain ideas from Islamic theology, certain ideas even from Christian theology, even certain ideas from India, so forth. Then you have treatises, usually called in Hebrew igeret, which would, in English, it literally means a letter, but the better translation would be a monograph. Those are ethical treatises on specific subjects. So, for example, if you wanted a treatise, say in this season of the high holidays, on repentance, you can find such a treatise. In Spain, for example, Rabbi Jonah Gerondi wrote a very big treatise called Sharei Tshuva, everything about repentance. What is repentance? What isn't repentance? How you repent? What's the role of confession in repentance? What's the role of regret in repentance? What are the things that help repentance? What prevents repentance? The whole treatise. It's all translated into English. You can read it now. There's one treatise I want to bring to your attention. You might want to read it, called the Igeret HaKodesh. This is on sexual ethics. This is a kind of mystical, ethical, sexual manual. And the reason I mention this one is because this is, as far as I know, the only book in the whole Jewish ethical literature that's been in 2 movies. You know which 2?
Told us last year.
That's right.
Yeah, but you weren't all here.
What is it?
You don't watch movies?
What are they?
That would be Woody Allen.
No, it's not Woody Allen.
I'd watch it.
All right, I'll give you a hint for the first one. Melanie Griffith.
Stranger Among Us.
Stranger Among Us. You remember this chassid is reading her all these, sexy things and all these profound things. That's from the Holy Letter, the Igeret HaKodesh. And the second movie, Barbara Streisand, is Yentl. You remember the scene where they're preparing for the wedding, and before the wedding he's reading up, kind of cramming. And this book, that's the Igeret HaKodesh. It's also translated in English. We have it in our library. So you have these books on specific subjects. Yeah.
I just need you to back up 1 minute. The Igeret is a type of ethical treatise?
It's an ethical treatise which is usually on a single ethical subject. In other words, the general treatise is on many subjects. The Igeret is usually on one subject.
Okay, and then so compared then to the first ones you were talking about, those were just more general, where they were just pulling together a lot of different ethical...
It's on many subjects. In other words, you may find in an Igeret a whole treatise on something that's treated in the general treatise in one chapter. So say in the Orchot Tzadikim, which I mentioned before, you'd have a chapter on repentance. But Gerondi has Sharei Tshuva, which is only on repentance. The whole book is on repentance. You have books of aphorisms. You have some of the ethical literature appearing as commentary form, mostly to either the ethics of the fathers or to Proverbs. You have a whole variety of forms, but I just want to mention one because you have the rest in the reading, and that is what is called the ethical will. The ethical will is usually written from a parent to a child, in which the parent tries to summarize the most important things he or she has learned from life and pass it down to the child. So in other words, when a person makes, say, a regular will, they make an inventory of everything they have and who gets what. An ethical will has been called an inventory of moral principles. It's all of the moral lessons the person has learned in the course of their life that they want to, and the course of learning and the course of experience, that they want then to pass on usually to the child. And in our library we have collections of ancient and medieval ethical wills, and we also have a number of collections of modern ethical wills, written in our own time. And it would be an interesting exercise if one day you tried. It's not easy to sit down and to compose your own ethical will. In other words, what have you learned from learning in life? What moral principles, what moral teachings would you want to pass down to those who come after? Now, in the time remaining tonight, I would like to sort of summarize some of the points I made so far, because now we are sort of at the end of topic 1, and before moving to topic 2, when we meet again in 2 weeks, I want to summarize some of the points already made about the ethics of Judaism. First of all, as we already discussed, when we are using the term Jewish ethics, what we are referring to here is not the ethics of Jews necessarily, but the ethics of Judaism. And the assumption we're making is that the two are not necessarily the same. And I discussed this in some detail last time. Secondly, as a form of ethical discourse that emerges from a particular religion, namely Judaism, Jewish ethics rests upon certain assumptions and uses certain methods in ethical decision-making, and poses moral problems in certain ways, and uses a certain vocabulary when dealing with ethical issues, and has certain concepts expressed by this vocabulary that often distinguish it from other forms of ethical discourse, both secular, philosophical, and religious. And therefore, to discover what the ethics of Judaism is, what we must do is to locate and to identify those concepts and that vocabulary and that process of decision-making and that way of posing ethical questions and those assumptions and how they differ from various other forms of ethical discourse. Got that? And part of that process, as we discussed last time, is hampered by the fact that since we live in a Western culture and are therefore culturally assimilated into Western culture, into concepts that come, for example, from American jurisprudence and in a largely Christian culture, we therefore begin with assumptions that are more likely than not to be outside Jewish thought than inside Jewish thought. And I already gave last time a number of examples. So just let me give one which I gave before to give you a frame of reference, and that is, for instance, the focus on rights in Anglo-American law as opposed to the focus on obligations and the focus on what is permitted and forbidden in Jewish law. Thirdly, we saw that Jewish ethics offers an alternative to the apparent dilemma of having to choose between a relativistic ethic and an absolutist ethic. And I'm not suggesting by any means that Jewish ethics is the only ethical system that gives you an alternative to those two options, but I am suggesting that it does give you an alternative to those two options. That it is neither a relativistic ethic nor an absolutistic ethic with all the problems that that entails. Fourthly, we saw tonight that Jewish ethics offers us both objective and subjective criteria for ethical decision-making and to the question of why be moral. The objective criteria come from certain theological assumptions, from, for example, the assumption that God exists, revelation, the existence of authoritative texts, and an objective literary sacred tradition. And the subjective from the use of all the things we discussed, reason, emotion, intention, current norms, and process of interpretation within a structure. Therefore, what we have in Jewish ethics is a kind of system of checks and balances, the subjective against the objective. And I would suggest that this is one of the strengths of Jewish ethics, because it shows that it is not a monolithic system, not a very limited system, but a more complete system than other systems of ethical discourse, including secular systems, which often argue that secular systems, by definition, are more open than religious systems. What I'm arguing here is the opposite, namely that because Jewish ethics has this system of checks and balances, has this subjective and objective component, it is actually more open and more flexible than most secular systems. Fifthly, that one of the major goals of Jewish ethics is to provide a roadmap to how to create life as an art form, and particularly how to create life as an art form through the cultivation of the moral virtues, that's the midot in Hebrew, and through the observance of the commandments, that's the mitzvot in Hebrew. In other words, that one of the major goals of Jewish ethics is not simply to give us a relativistic system or an absolutistic system, but rather to help us work through the problem of what kind of people, what kind of person each of us should want to be and can be. That's the subjective. And what kind of person God would want us to be and can be. And what kind of person the tradition known as Judaism prescribes for us to be and can be. In other words, here again you have the subjective and the objective. You have a middle path between the absolutistic and relativistic, in that the goal from this perspective is how to shape our own character in a concrete way and in a personal way, not with abstract values or prescriptions, but with concrete and applied ways of building a moral character from the building blocks we get from tradition, but which we can figure out how to apply to our own particular life. The sixth point is that the ethics of Judaism is a form of theological ethics, and as such it rests on certain theological assumptions. And certain assumptions, which we'll discuss next time, regarding how Jewish theology depicts human nature. Because as we discussed earlier tonight, each ethical system rests upon certain assumptions that an ethical system makes about human nature, in terms of what the nature of the human being is, and therefore what can be expected of us. The seventh point has to do with the relationship between law and ethics. In many systems, law and ethics are very sharply distinguished one from the other. For example, in Anglo-American jurisprudence, you have a very sharp distinction always made between the legal and the ethical. In certain forms of Christianity, a very sharp distinction between the legal and the ethical, almost as if the legal is bad and the ethical somehow is something completely different and good. In the ethics of Judaism, the two are intertwined. And the goal, I would say, is that the law, in the best, if the system is working right, the law should articulate the ethical principles. In other words, that the function of law is to concretize ethical principles. And if the system is not working right, then that's not happening. This is why you have, for example, in the 13th century, one of the greatest rabbis in Spain in the 13th century, Nachmanides, not to be confused with Maimonides, Nachmanides, in his commentary on Leviticus, coins a term that is then quoted since then, in the 13th century, since then, which sort of summarizes this position. He says there in his commentary that a person can be, in Hebrew, naval birshut haTorah, a scoundrel within the limits of the law. In other words, that if the law is working right, the law should concretize ethical behavior and express ethical behavior. But if the law isn't working right, then it's possible to observe all the laws and still morally be a scoundrel. So I would say you have this idea of the intertwining of the legal and the ethical traditions. The eighth point, which I'll develop another time, but which I mentioned to you last week, is that within the ethics of Judaism, we have very often, more often than not, multiple ethical answers to many or most ethical questions. Not infinite numbers of answers, but finite number of answers, all of which exist as equally valid within the framework of tradition and as precedents within the tradition. So, for example, say on an issue of how do you do repentance, you have, say, 10 different options of how you do it. And then what you do is you choose within those options which one is most compatible with your own spiritual nature. And the final assumption, the final point I want to mention, which we discussed just a few minutes ago, is the assumption, two assumptions upon which all of Jewish ethics is based today. All Jewish law is based today. The first assumption is that the ethics of Judaism, being a system of religious ethics, deals with all aspects of life, because religion deals with all aspects of life. In other words, there should be no ethical issue that Judaism should be unable to deal with, because religion deals with all aspects of life and ethics are human problems. And the second assumption, which we discussed just now, is the assumption that somehow, through a process of interpretation, ancient and medieval texts can be applied to the most contemporary and the most cutting-edge problems. In other words, that if you're dealing, for example, with a question of the propriety, say, of ovum transplants in reproductive biotechnology, that somehow in some medieval or ancient Jewish text this is dealt with. And we'll see exactly which texts those are, where these ideas are anticipated. And then is the question of how to apply that to the problem that is before us now. But the operating assumption there, just like the assumption that issues now which are very technologically cutting edge are already anticipated by the Constitution, the assumption there is that issues, no matter how cutting edge, no matter how contemporary, are already somehow anticipated by the tradition. So next week we will begin by discussing the second topic, namely human nature as a basis for ethics. And if during that time you think of any questions about what we discussed tonight, please ask. Okay?